So thanks to everyone who came out, and for my relatives who came from Bozeman and different parts of Missoula. Thank you for being here. So we all just met each other between last night and 10 minutes ago, and I found out that I'm the moderator. So
Thank you.
So we're going to start by, each of us is going to do a little reading from our book just to give you a flavor of it, and maybe just say a little bit about what your book is about, and then read a little bit. And I'll let whoever wants to start.
Why are you looking at me? Okay, she's looking at me. And just by way of my saying thank you for being here, I need to say a few words about the person who is ultimately responsible for me being here, and that's my dad. He was a master swimmer. He swam a mile a day for the last 25 years of his life. He virtual swam from his home in Portland to my brother's home in New Jersey, and so for a while there I was the only person I knew who had a father swimming out I-90, and he was spotted taking the Bozeman exit maybe to see your relatives. But anyway, the last meet of his life was the Nike World Games in our hometown, and I was at the meet holding lap cards for him, and I overheard a reporter talking to a swimmer who was swimming in the age 90 to 95 category. And the reporter said, "I bet you're excited to be here." And the swimmer said, "I'm 93 years old, I'm excited to be anywhere." And it was that sentiment that brings me here today to say I'm so excited to be with you, because it was my inheritance from my father that ultimately brought me here. So what was that inheritance? It was an intellectual piece of property called the brick wall. A brick wall is what genealogists call people who nobody will talk about. And when my father passed to me all of his genealogical research, I took it upon myself to become a genealogist and expanded that research to the point where I had 12,000 names in my husband's family tree. And in doing so, I connected with families all over the world, and I helped people as far away as Australia and Russia build their family trees. And what I found out was that every family has one, has a brick wall, has that person that no one will talk about. And we have names for these people that aren't very nice, don't we? We call them black sheep, we call them bad eggs, or if you're vegan, bad apple. But in any case, there's always this aura of taboo around these people. And in my family tree, the brick wall was 3 generations back. And she's a woman that I call Annie Rushton. That is not her real name. And the only thing I knew about her was that she was a woman, that she was a mother, and that she was born on a farm in Iowa in 1885, and that her blood runs in the veins of my children. And that was reason enough for me to want to know why the silence surrounding Annie Rushton. And because we don't have a lot of time today, I'm going to compress the story and tell you that after a search of many years that included many people not talking to me about this, through a lot of digging and a little bit of luck, I did find the truth about the silence surrounding Annie Rushton. And it was that she had recurring perinatal and postpartum psychosis in the early part of the 20th century. So I had to imagine being in her place. What would it be like to be a woman who's not yet out of her teens, barely married a few months, gives birth, and falls into a long and terrifying episode of mental illness. So this clip that I'm going to read for you starts with what we call in fiction the inciting incident, and it does take place in Iowa before the book takes its major leap to Montana. So she's been married a few months, and then the baby comes. 9 months, let me not do that to her. Exactly 9 months, though. A heavy curtain dropped on their brief happiness. The Annie who rose from the childbed was a creature neither of them knew, rocking maniacally in her chair and wishing it would go over backward. She could not understand the rages that engulfed her, dropping out of the sky like the cyclone 3 years before that tossed their barn, cows and all, into the North 40. But she understood enough to be scared. scared for herself and for the bundle of suffocating obligation that was her newborn daughter. Instead of moving on, as cyclones always do, this twister of the soul remained in place, spinning and roaring and draining her of everything she knew to be Annie. 19 years of becoming undone and gone. In creating a new life, she'd been robbed of hers. Her sweet, forbearing husband, Thomas, she tried to tell him the baby was a tourniquet, squeezing until her sensibilities spilled from her ears. It's sucking the life right out of me. Thomas bent over the rocker where she nursed. She, he said. Cynthia is a she, not an it. Annie's arms went slack around the baby, who pulled herself into a ball of clenched limbs, anxious mouth searching for the breast that should have still been there. The whimpers escalated to wails. Annie yanked the blanket tighter. Swaddling is supposed to quiet babies, but not this one, not this howling lump of never enough, this potato with lungs. And Annie, who used to be a she, not an it, leaned her dead weight back in her rocking chair. Heaving to and fro, she couldn't remember a time when the sensation of being on fire wasn't her omnipresent warden. But outside, 4 interminable months later, it was cooler, oh yes. The frozen branches of the poplars flailed in the dry wind. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall, and Annie thinks, I wouldn't be that lucky. She hated her own thoughts as they wormed their maggoty way through her. For weeks upon weeks, Thomas refused to believe what she tried to tell him, that she yearned to be free of her torment, that she must give the baby up. She felt herself ebbing away by the day, and his feeble explanations and pleas couldn't dam the slide. She avoided his eyes as he stroked her sweat-soaked hair and gave no voice to what she knew he must have been wondering, the question under which she cowered every minute of each eternity of a day. How long? How much longer would they have to hang on to ride out the inexplicable possession of a woman who used to be Annie? At 2:00 on a bitter December night, she lay rigid in their bed, grinding her teeth until her jaw spasmed. Beside her, Thomas stirred. Baby's hungry. It came to her as an apology, and from someplace remote, a voice eerily like hers snapped their life in two. I don't give a damn. All of a sudden, the picture came into focus. This is his doing, she thought, and watched a disembodied fist smash into his face. The crack of the cheekbone under her blow felt good. I told him the baby was too much for me, but did he listen? Then the disembodied fist flew on disembodied feet down the hallway, where it joined up with a disembodied voice screeching as she rifled the kitchen cabinets. Where, oh where do we keep the rat poison? Down the hall, Thomas secured the door of the nursery, muffling the squalling baby, and stood there rooted as an elm, arms crossed, feet apart, a blackening contusion spreading under his eye. The remaining scraps of Annie fought their way to the surface and died on contact with the horror she'd created. What little of her was left could still walk, though, must walk, across the house, out the door, and who knew, who cared where. The baby sobbed for all of them, louder at first, but a mother's most sacred duty is to protect her baby no matter what the cost. So Annie stumbled on until the cries quieted under a blanket of distance. Who could fault Thomas for understanding less about a woman's rages that dropped from the sky than she did herself, and for coming to a swift decision based on what he did know? This plaintiff states that because of the actions and threats made by this defendant, his life and the life of his daughter are imperiled. Plaintiff hereby prays that he may be granted an absolute decree of divorce from this defendant and that he may be awarded sole custody of his daughter. So, in my research, I learned that sometimes a document can come to you with a weird energy that when you hold them, it's almost like you were there yourself. And this document was like that, and it created thousands of questions that I needed to answer. I wrote them down. This is it. Among the things I asked about her situation, where did she go when she walked out the door? Where could she go? given what she did? Was there any safe place for her? How much longer did her symptoms last? Had there been any treatment? And in that time, what might that treatment have looked like? Was she represented in court during her divorce proceedings? In the all-male legal system of her day, would any lawyer have taken her as a client? Did she have anything in the way of parental rights? And after this shocking document became public, what place would there have been for her in a small town where everybody knows everything about everybody else? And most of all, I wondered, would there be any compassion for her? Or would she have been sentenced to a lifetime of whispers and stigma and people avoiding her on the sidewalk? So the short answer to those questions was no. She, however, remained in that community who cut a wide berth around her for another 6 years until it turned out that there was a second chance for her. A brother with a homestead in Glasgow, Montana, offered her the opportunity to come live with him and start fresh. And of course, she couldn't get there fast enough. And once there, almost immediately, she meets and tangles with a colleague of her brother's, one Adam Fielding, who is as determined as she is to make his way in the world without a partner. And let's say it's not love at first sight, it's more like his irresistible force to her immovable object. And when I was getting to know these people, researching them, I called them the boneheads. But when her brother gives into the wanderlust that brought him to Montana originally, they give into this Jones that they have for each other and a kind of irresistible business opportunity. So the marriage is at first a sizzler and filled with entrepreneurial success, but underlying their dreams is the one thing that's going to threaten to unravel it all, and that is her illness. Because it's been lurking these 6 years. And now the Fieldings want a family, and that illness will once again step into the full light of day, and this time in a community far less tolerant and compassionate than the one she left. So at this point, the story becomes about you as readers, and I want to ask you for a moment to think about your core values. What matters most to you as people? And most of us are going to answer and say family, partner, children, home, safety, financial stability, autonomy, and our right of self-determination. And now think about, imagine you have what she had, which is what we now know today to be a bona fide treatable medical illness. But law enforcement, the judicial system, the medical profession of the day is going to judge your illness a character defect or a moral failing. And you can be labeled a lunatic or a criminal, and you can be sentenced in a court of law and in the court of public opinion to some form of involuntary commitment. So those are really terrifying possibilities, and the fact that those are the things that Annie attained and then had to regain are the core of a story which I have to say is not completely terror and loss, because if it was, I wouldn't have written the book. But what we have here is a story with a new definition of love wins. Because when you think of all those things that I just mentioned that are our core, the reason they matter most to us is because that's what we love. So I'll leave you with the words of a friend of mine who summed the book up in a way that I couldn't do any better. And he said, wow, a good thing, a good cry, a good blood-riling social injustice commentary, and an achingly beautiful love story about everything that matters.
Good morning, I'm Carrie Lasser. I'm the author of
The Home Place that came out from William Morrow in 2014, and The Weight of an Infinite Sky that just came out earlier this year. And I have stories in a couple of anthologies called Montana Noir and Sandstone that may be here, probably. They're really good at stocking everything. And I want to thank Fact and Fiction and anybody who's here from the festival for putting on such a great show every year and keeping it alive. I think we're all really grateful that that's succeeded one more year. There is such a fine line between what's writing and what's therapy. I think a lot of writers are getting it down on paper so that we're not just walking down the street mumbling to ourselves. And sometimes I do that anyway. But the writing allows the individual to work through a lot in the present day and in the past, things that can reach back generations. And if we do it well, it helps us work through some universal and communal issues. And I think that's why we read, trying to figure out some essential things about who we are and who other people are, and get that sliver of different perspective that might cast some light on what's dark and confusing in our own lives. And my first few books were a lot of that. They're set in Montana, they're set in Billings and Bighorn County, and we've got a lot of family history in those parts of the state. So we started out in The Home Place with a Seattle lawyer who has to come back and deal with her younger sister's death on an ice slab on the wrong side of town in Billings on a cold January night. And The Weight of an Infinite Sky is not a sequel, but it's got some of the same characters. It happens in the same fictional universe. And in this book, Anthony Fry was not at all the rancher's son his rancher dad had hoped for. He wanted to be an actor, and he was putting on musicals in the barn and wanted to play with his toy horses rather than the real horses, and none of this was okay. And then he wasn't even gay, because at least that would have explained it. So Anthony has come back from New York, having failed really dramatically to be an actor. So everything he thought his life was headed toward has not worked. His father has recently died in a horseback riding accident. His mother and uncle are cozying up to each other. And as I've read a lot of Shakespeare, and as I began to write this book, I suddenly realized I was writing Hamlet. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I mean, many novelists write Shakespeare over and over and over again, and it's fascinating to read. There's a whole series right now with Margaret Atwood rewriting The Tempest and other amazing people. You should look it up. Hagseed is Atwood's book. So I went with that for a while, and then it went off in other directions, because these characters are their own people. So the page or so I want to read you this morning is Anthony in Billings at the theater, where he's directing a children's summer theater camp, and trying to hold everything together. He's got a bit of an alcohol problem, and he's just slept with an old girlfriend he probably shouldn't have gone near. And the board is on his back about a few things. Then someone's leaving anonymous poetry for him. So it's just a little morning in the life of Anthony in the middle of the book, or actually mid-afternoon. It was mid-afternoon the following Monday, and cool inside the sanctum of the theater. Anthony had his knees wedged under the steel desk in the windowless converted closet he called an office, as he struggled earnestly with workers' compensation registration for the camp staff, the top of a pile of paperwork 3 inches thick. That morning he left another message on Hillary's out-of-range cell phone about the workshop. She was ignoring him again. He wasn't about to call Chance and ask for her. Another anonymous haiku set at Anthony's elbow on torn notebook paper, from one of the campers, no doubt. He had a suspect in mind. They were delicate efforts, child's play with language, but they drew him in. He wanted to know the poet better. Solstice night. A full moon lights the sagebrush. What silence. One of the counselors stuck her head in. "There's someone waiting for you out front," she said, and disappeared just as quickly. Campers were assembling in the hall for pickup, with a noise like a riot getting started. Anthony was proud of how well the counselors had taken charge of their roles. His supervision was becoming more unnecessary every day. Probably this was more credit to them, being ambitious college students, than to his management skills, but it was an item in the plus column for the board. The visitor must be Hillary, he thought as he extracted himself from the desk. She'd promised another visit if she'd meant that throwaway line at chances. What a welcome distraction she would be. He could schedule a workshop and find out if she and Chance were getting back together. Anthony hurried to the front doors, eager to offer Hillary his listening ear and soft shoulder. Instead, it was Jessie, who sat alone on the top step, facing the street full of parents' cars, holding something on her lap. Anthony wasn't exactly sorry to see her, but he had little to say that she'd want to hear. He'd texted thanks for last night on Saturday afternoon out of simple politeness. She'd answered, "So much fun, let's grab a drink sometime next week." Anthony hadn't answered. Now here she was, only 2 days later, tracking him down at work. When he opened the door, Jessie turned and he saw a small plant in a plastic pot, tied with a wide purple ribbon around the rim. She smiled and held it out to him. "I brought you something," she said. He took it and sniffed as he sat beside her. "You brought me rosemary." Rosemary was one of his favorite smells, like sage with a personal stylist. "Thank you." "Why?" "I asked the florist for something to express sympathy. I felt like I was kind of insensitive about your dad and everything the other night. Your mom and your uncle getting married like that. I mean, geez, your head must be spinning." Insensitive or not, in truth, she had given him exactly what he needed, but Anthony wasn't about to say that. Nothing to apologize for. Rosemary for remembrance, that's right. Hamlet again. "I'll try to keep it alive." He rested it on the step between them as he sat, a barrier shrub. "So that was all. I had to come into town to pick up stuff for the vet's office, and I thought you could use some moral support." Jessie looked him in the eye with a flirtatious squint, half leaned in as if to kiss him, then seemed to lose her nerve. She withdrew and started playing with grass in the crack between the steps. "That was really sweet of you." Anthony leaned and kissed her cheek in a light platonic brush off, but she turned her head to match his lips with hers. Their eyes met, resistance and demand. "Sweet women are really very angry people," Wasserstein remarked in his head. "They're trapped by their own repressed hostility." Anthony had never done well at resisting angry women. Things went so much better when you let them have their way. And then, because I'm not working on this book at all anymore, haven't been for a year and a half, I'm doing entirely different things. Wanted to give you just a short poem or two from a collection I'm working on. And this is the hard thing. You finish a book and you send it off, and months or even years later, you're still talking about that thing that you've completely forgotten about, and there's something new going on. So I'm writing a new novel, and I'm working on short stories and poetry. And this one is called Huntley Butte, which is a geographical formation between Absaroka and Columbus in Stillwater County, where my great-grandparents homesteaded. The roof fell in while I was away at grad school. Soft pine timbers gave under snow, raccoons, and the insults of time. Swing low, the house of my great-grandparents, swing low. A low, dry ridge line from Absaroka to Columbus guards the bones of the homestead, the dust of my ancestors' blood and sweat. In the hard years, they were all hard years. We took odd jobs, never even. We've been truck drivers and cowboys, shepherds and midwives, Marines and roughnecks, seasonal hands at the sugar beet plant. Now a guy from Flagstaff wants to buy us out at $250 an acre. Swing low, the house of my great-grandparents, swing low. Still for a while we had this, the broadest piece of sky, 640 acres of dry land to prove up, a house, draft horses named Greta and Charlie, the beginnings of pride.
Okay, so my name is Sue Henderson. I'm from New York, but I have lots of family here in Montana. And The Flicker of Old Dreams is about the death of small town America as told by a mortician. And what inspired me to write this book was there was such a sense of growing rage and division between one American and another. And you'd see it on TV, and you'd see it on bumper stickers, and you'd see it in your neighborhoods. And I was starting to see more and more friends unfriending people or canceling extended family dinners and holidays because they weren't able to get along. And I felt like, well, I have a stake in both Americas. And so I felt like I wanted to write a book that really tried to look at where did we lose our empathy for each other, and is there a way to open up a dialogue between us again? So I didn't know what I was going to write. The only thing I knew was that I was not going to write about politics. So as I was sort of thinking about all this stuff, I started having this strong urge to go back to a town that I knew really well from my childhood, which is Winnett, Montana. And I'll talk about it more later as we do our panel, but I'll talk about Winnett later. So I'm gonna just give you a little taste of the book. It's very short. The narrator is a mortician, and this part of the book is the first time that the reader gets to go down into the basement with her where she does her embalming, and there's a guest waiting down there for her. The dead come to me vulnerable, sharing their stories and secrets. Here is my scar, touch it. Here is that roll of fat I always hid under the big sweater, and now you see. This is the person I've kept private, afraid of what people would think. Here I am, all of me, scarred, flabby, covered in bed sores. Please be kind. When a body comes to our funeral home, it comes draped in a white sheet. The sheets begin clean, but soon they carry the essence of the one who died. First in silhouette, the contour of the nose, a valley or mountain at the stomach, the feet turn slightly in or out, the bumps of shoulders, breasts, chin. Before I move the sheet aside, I study this landscape. At first glance, it is like a field covered in snow. Then the details become visible. Just as a field of snow, upon closer inspection, shows signs of the life that has tramped through it, so will the sheet show something beyond its surface. There are smears and drips, a spot of blood from where the IV was removed, a stain from loose bowels not thoroughly wiped, the sticky smear of saliva, the gray shadow of one final sweat. I pull back the sheet and welcome Mr. Mosley to the bright white silence of my workroom, take his cold hand and hold it gently in my own. His face, neck, and hands are red and toughened from years of working in sun and cold and wind. The rest of him is quite pale, soft. I don't often get to know my neighbors until we meet this way, and that is the case with Mr. Mosley. His wrecked body lies on the stainless steel table, a faucet near his head, a drain near his feet, and there is much to do, but first this, his hand. Here is the man, nothing to hide behind, no sheet or uniform or name tag. This is the man without his possessions, with chores left undone, with mistakes he can't make right, with nothing more he can prove. I'm right here, I tell him. It is what I have longed for my whole life. Perhaps everyone longs for this, just to be and to have someone stay near. He does not complain that my hands are clammy. There is no pressure to be charming or clever. We are simply here together in this quiet. Thank you. So, this is, all of us wrote books that are set in Montana, so I wonder if each of you would talk a little bit about the part of Montana that appears in your book and what drew you to that place in Montana.
Is it going to be okay if we sit to talk, or should we, can everybody hear even?
There's
back there?
also
Is it
some
okay?
seats up
There
here
are
on the front.
A bunch of seats if you'd like to be where you can hear better.
Okay. I think that was a yes.
Okay, we're good.
We're good. Montana.
Oh, do you want me to start? I thought I was talking first. My novel, as I mentioned, the inciting incident starts in Iowa, but quickly brings the protagonists both to the Glasgow area of the state. And I learned, and so the facts brought me to that location. And what I quickly learned was there's not much written about that corner of the state other than Fort Peck Dam, which of course was long after my story took place. So it was really interesting for me, and I did go there, and I went to every location in Montana that's mentioned in my book, because there's this sense, I think, that you have to walk the land and walk in the footsteps of the people that you're writing about in order to give it that authenticity. And I have been told by Montanans that the book has authenticity as far as that sense of place. So because of the incidents that I described in my reading, the story moves across the state in the second half of the book to Warm Springs, Twin Bridges, Butte, Anaconda, Helena, and probably some other places that I'm not thinking about at the moment, but it moves to the southwest corner of the state because that's where the facts took me.
And I'm writing primarily about Billings and south and east of Billings, and it's a lot of family stories. And I've found out more about both places since I started writing. People just come up and share their own memories and their own history, and that's one of the best parts about it. But I start the home place, my first book, on the south side of Billings, cold January night. You're apparently never supposed to start a book with the weather, so at least I got that. That taboo out of the way in my first book. I'm about to see how many more rules I can find to break. And the South Side is still, 100 years later, the wrong side of town. It's the economically depressed side of Billings, and there's still a lot more crime as you get south of the tracks. The tracks divide Billings north and south, as they do a lot of towns. And the closer you get to the river and the sugar beet factory and the refineries and this little town called Lockwood out there, the rougher things get. And that's where my dad's family moved when they first came in from the homestead in the 40s. And so he had memories of those places. My aunts tell stories. My dad would drive us around the south side, and it wasn't just like we lived in that shack. It was more like, okay, that vacant lot there where they tore something down years ago. Yeah, we lived in the basement. And that was the way he grew up, just really feeling like the kid from the wrong side of the tracks that nobody wanted anything to do with. But there's also history there. There's still a Meadow Gold Dairy just off Minnesota in Billings, and my aunts remember back when they used to deliver the milk with horse-drawn carts, and they would shoe the horses out behind the dairy. And so the kids from the neighborhood would go over and, of course, wanted to help with the horse. I don't know how much they were actually helping with the horses, but in their version of, gauzy history, they got to pet the horses and brush them and help take care of them. And it's a really fond memory from their childhood, still having the animals there in town. And then out into the county, there's a lot of family history from my mother's family. The Flies homesteaded. They came from what is now Gallatin County, where they'd arrived in the 1860s. They went over to Bighorn County. And there's still cousins out there. And I got to actually be at the auction that cleaned out the last of the farm equipment in the place that had been there for generations. And so writing about these things has brought me tighter into the history I'm writing about. And a lot of the historical stories in the books are lifted whole cloth from family history. So it's a way of getting that down, making the record.
So my father is from the town of Winnett, and before that, actually, he was from Makeha. Is that right, Cousin Dean?
Yes.
If you don't
Could
know,
you speak up, please? We
Sure.
can hear you here, but I doubt they can back there.
okay. So Winnett is central eastern Montana, and it's a town of about 180 people, and there's one paved road. There's one place to eat, although I heard it just closed, and it's a town where you can though there's 180 people there, you might only ever see maybe 9 at a time, so it feels much smaller. And when I was a kid, we used to take a day trip out to our family cemetery, which was in the breaks along Lodgepole Creek in Garfield County. And it was just kind of like a piece of land in the middle of nowhere with barbed wire around it. And we would go out there with our shovels and our shotguns to clear the sagebrush and the rattlesnakes out of the grave. So this was sort of, the visiting the relatives place that we went. And when I was working on this book, I went back to Winnett and I stayed there for a month. And I was not at all planning to write about Winnett. The book is not about Winnett or any particular town. The book I had intended to be a story of wrestling with our division. But I went there and just wanted to sort of separate myself from New York and immerse myself in the wind and the pace and the grit and the geography and the weather of this town. So that's where I wrote the book. And I think my main feeling while I was there was just sort of an awe of the stark and harsh landscape. It was so beautiful and it was so tough, and just the fierce self-sufficiency of the people who lived there. So that part definitely made it into the book. So all of our books have some economic hardship in them, and I wonder if you would talk about how that's a part of your story.
Well, what was really striking to me when I was writing about the economic hardship of the period was that I was writing it in about 2008, which was about the time our economy here was also going into a boom and bust cycle. And what was happening in Montana in the early 1920s was exactly the same thing. There'd been this huge influx of homesteaders with the Homestead Act and the free land, and the myth that there was good rainfall in the northeast corner of the state, when in fact they only had 10 years worth of records, and that happened to have been a wet period. So the wet period comes to an end, and the dry period sets in right about the same time that there's a flu epidemic and a world war that we're being drawn into, which also creates political divisions within the community. And as all of this is happening, the drought sets in, the homesteads can't produce, the men are at war, and the whole thing just implodes. So you have, and the characters in my book too are facing what they thought was going to be a long and prosperous run at farming, and in fact the wind, it's literally gone with the wind as the winds are coming in and picking up the land and throwing it over the horizon. So what happened in that period of the early 1920s was people were leaving just as fast as they came in, and the banks were failing because of the manner in which they had extended credit without collateral, and it kind of formed this economic collapse that carried through the Depression, and like the rest of the country, pretty much didn't pull out of it until we got into the very lucrative business of war in the late 1930s. So all of that plays out in The River by Starlight.
I write quite a bit about people who are what we'd refer to as land rich and cash poor. And I was one of the people who grew up in town, and the land had gotten entailed away to cousins who were still out in the county. And all this became really real to me in a policy way. I'm writing a review of Saris Marsh's new book, Heartland. It's the tagline is something like growing up poor and working hard in Kansas. And she's on a grandparents' farm, and there's a lot of back and forth to kind of the rough side of Wichita, and retail jobs and waitressing jobs, and all these jobs that the women in the family just keep holding to have health insurance and bring in a little cash and try to keep the farm going. And I had this, as I started reading Smarsh's book, I had this reaction where I thought, yeah, but you're a farm kid. Nobody feels sorry for the farm kids. I mean, you got animals and you got places to run, and your dad is treated with respect, right? No matter how poor he is, he's got the land, and people respect that. They judge him based on how he takes care of the land and how he takes care of his neighbors, not how much money he's actually making, which is probably somewhere close to breaking even if he's lucky. And as I got farther into the book and read the life her family had led, the life she led, suddenly there's kind of this flash of realization that this is kind of what working class people do to each other. Like, we create the divisions. Like, you've got it a little bit better than I do, and so your story is not legitimate. Or I'm doing a little better than you, so I'm fine, I'm middle class. Like, my grandma, who got a 6th grade education and worked just about every day of her life and grew her own food, always referred to herself as middle class. Working middle class, but not working class. And we create these fine divisions because somehow that allows us to have a sense of pride in who we are, and no sense of common identity, no sense of the need for some kind of solidarity and fighting for a better deal for all of us as a people who are working to survive. And I hope that's something I can bring back into my own writing, because the fine divisions just suddenly came really clear to me in reading that book.
Write that down, that'll be cool.
Oh, I am. I'm writing a review. It's all in.
So when I went to Win It for a month, I basically walked around, took pictures, listened. I said yes to everything. If there was a calf tagging, if someone invited me to dinner, they have a book club there. So I said yes to everything. And then, but I didn't end up writing a lot while I was there. So when I got back to New York, I started looking through the pictures I had taken, and I was really struck with my memory of talking to people and the incredible pride and commitment to the life that they were living. And then the pictures I was seeing, and my camera had told a completely different picture, and the buildings were tipped sideways. Every 2 or 3 buildings had been empty for decades. There was an abandoned grain elevator. The railroad tracks were covered with dirt. And so I was starting to become interested in that tension there. So, and how many people were unemployed and underemployed for a long time, and how often they referred to their job as something they hadn't done for 20 years. So that started to become the core of what I was thinking about, that I'm witnessing a death. I'm witnessing the death of a town and a way of life and an identity that people have had. And so as I started working, because I was not wanting to write about Win It, but Win It was like wanting to at least get deeply into my setting, I borrowed from Win It the Rimrocks, the single diner in town. I borrowed the wind for sure. Mm-hmm. I borrowed the abandoned grain elevator. I borrowed the train tracks. I borrowed the dirt roads and the cattle. And then I thought, well, now I want my imagination to play with it. So I removed 2 of the gas pumps from the town, and I put a funeral home in there instead. And then I made the town much more gothic. I made the wind a character. And then I thought, okay, how can I take this really vivid setting and infuse it with the division of our times, which is what I really wanted to write about, is where we're struggling to empathize with each other. So I decided to start the book off with a big fictional accident that would set the town into fast decline. And so that's kind of, where the book starts, and that allowed me to set up the people who fear change against people who are desperate for change in conflict with each other. So each of us have central characters in our books who are misfits. They have a hard time fitting into the place where they live, and they have a hard time feeling that they're understood. And so I wonder if you could talk about those misfits in your book.
Well, I think the most striking thing about Annie in my book is how relevant her plight still is today, and how little we have advanced in the 114 years since the incident I just read to you. There are women, even nowadays, who, if they mention postpartum depression to their doctors, most notably a woman in Sacramento earlier this year was given a police escort to a local hospital and held for 10 hours until a social worker showed up and sent her home without ever seeing a doctor or ever getting any medication. And without even a follow-up appointment, told her she didn't need any help. And she told her story, and it went viral, and thousands of women came forward with the same story, and I call them the Them Too movement. But what was most striking to me, and I don't even have to comment on the politics of today and this week specifically, is that women were and are judged so much differently than men. And Annie, with her documentable illness, was judged for behaviors that were directly attributable to her illness. And yet, when her husband does some of the very same behaviors, he gets away with it and she's punished for it. And this is not a commentary on him personally, but just kind of the context of the times, is that what makes a misfit? It's usually someone who's misunderstood, and the fact that we tend to fear that which we don't understand. And even today, what do you mean you don't love your baby? You can't pull up those feelings for your baby. But isn't it true that in most of us, love takes time? It takes time to develop, and nobody back then was saying, how can we help this person? She clearly needs help. So I think that the message that I was telling in writing this story was that I didn't think Annie should be the person that nobody talked about, and I wanted her to be the person that everybody talked about, because her story is timeless and it's also timely. And that meant it was about time to tell this story.
Yeah, going back to writing as therapy, I just read an article analyzing people's responses to first dates. Like everyone, there's what you say out loud, and then there's what you walk away and think to yourself after you've met anybody for the first time, whether it's a date or just somebody you meet in a professional context, whatever. And our instinct as human beings is to walk away thinking, I totally screwed that up. That person didn't like me. I seemed like an idiot. That's what we all carry away. We all have that voice, even if we blend in very well on the surface, and some people really do. We all walk away with that feeling inside, like I'm not connecting, nobody gets what's going on. And so the writing, why would you write about a character who didn't feel that? It's such a fundamental human experience. I'm the misfit, and how am I ever going to find people who can see what's really going on in here and understand and hear me? I just think that's the beginning of almost any story.
So my misfit, yeah.
Did we get to ask questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
I have kind of a burning question for you, and it kind of goes to the research that people do when they're writing novels.
Yeah.
And yours is written apparently from a perspective of a mortician, and I wonder if you hung out with a mortician or how you knew all that stuff.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll talk about the mortician now because she's my misfit. So, I didn't at all know I was going to be writing about a funeral home or a mortician. The reason I thought of it was I wanted to write about the death of a town, and so I started brainstorming who would be the best person to tell the story. And I thought of lots of things, and I thought, wow, what if someone from a funeral home told the story, because she would know death, she wouldn't flinch at it, she wouldn't be defensive or afraid to look at the ugly parts of death, and also that she could bring dignity and compassion to the dying. And I felt like that was really important in that story, but that meant I had to suddenly learn a whole lot about how to run a funeral home and how to embalm dead bodies. I read a lot of books. I audited a certificate class on becoming an embalmer. I spoke to hospice folks, I spoke to funeral folks. I had someone on call who I would say, if this happens to the body and you've only got this much money to repair it, what would you do? And she'd say, I use some upholstery stuffing. So I just, I just borrowed her ideas. But Mary as the misfit she's 30 and she still lives in the childhood home, which is a funeral home with her father, who's the funeral director. And she's just never fit in with the town. The town has very strong traditions, and her sense of self and her sense of what she wants in her life just don't fit with the town's. So she's someone who's really learned to kind of push down her instincts, her opinions, her passions, and she's just more and more staying in this basement workroom where she's very tender and interactive with people once they've died, but she doesn't really know how to work with them when they're alive. So what I did in the story is I thought I need to send her out into the living world, so I made the storyline push her out to where she's not confident, and then that's sort of where her journey starts to take off. Last question, and then we'll open it up for everyone, but each of our books takes the characters and the readers to an uncomfortable place. And I wonder if you could talk about sort of where you're going to take people and or even what it's like for you as a writer to kind of go into the dark and look around.
Well, like you, I had to learn a lot of things that I didn't know anything about. I don't know what the workings of a mental hospital look like. I don't know other things that I don't want to give away before I read the book. What was the question?
Into the dark.
Taking the characters and the readers into the dark.
Yeah. Well, again, to me, the more I researched it and the more I found out about her situation and the individual personalities of the people involved, the more I felt like this was a story about gender inequity of the time. But I also came to feel an empathy that I did not expect for Adam, who is the male half of a marriage where postpartum psychosis is threatening to take away everything that means anything to both of them. And if the woman's story was one that was seldom told, the man's side of that story was one that was never told, and that was a very dark place for him as well, because no one ever considered what does it feel like to just utterly fail like that and to not have it in you, because why would it be there if you've never had to confront something like this and there's no community resources to help with that or anything, is to just feel that you are not adequate to this situation and have no idea what to do. And like Carrie, I felt as the research went on and the characters were building, how could I not say this? How could I not get out this story that was so urgently needing to be told? And the serendipitous thing, I guess you could call it, is just as this book was coming into print, I started seeing things in the media about, hey, men can have postpartum depression too. As many as 28% of men suffer some kind of trauma or depression or something when their wife does too. So that portion of the story is starting to come into the light too. And I think if we don't go into those dark places, there's no one to lead these people to the light, whether it was 100 years ago or today. And I think the most amazing thing I can say about why do we go into the dark was, I don't know how this happened, but 3 days after my book was published, I don't know how it happened this quickly, I got a letter from a woman in New Zealand who said, I read your book, this is my story, this is my mother's story, this is my grandmother's story. A friend just called me and asked me if I had in fact written this book. And she says, and I want to say thank you because nothing in 2 years, not doctors, not medications, not therapies, has healed me as much as reading about your brave Annie.
Oh, that's so cool.
And that's why we write about dark.
It can be kind of a Rorschach test how people respond to the darkest incidents in what you've written. In The Home Place especially, there's kind of a twist at the end and something unexpected happens, and people come up to me after they've read it and have really polar opposite responses to that. So if you've read the book, don't give it away, but there's a response that says, yeah, that's right. That's the way it would happen, probably the way it should happen. Yeah. And the other response is, are you kidding me? Just outraged that this could be, that everyone would just leave it as it happened, and that wouldn't just explode everything. And so I think that again is a really important place for literature to take us, to where we have to look into our own moral makeup and ask, am I okay with this? How would I respond in that situation? And so I'm trying to, in the new work I'm doing, I'm drawing on the life of a communist poet and activist from Minnesota named Meridel Lasser. And people always ask me about her because we have a similar last name. It's not exactly the same, and I don't think we're related at all. But I started reading her work and actually went to Minnesota Historical Society, and her archive is now available. You can go through her handwritten notebooks and listen to all these amazing recorded interviews she did of everybody. Like everybody who was a major cultural figure in the 20th century. Jack Kerouac she interviewed, and well, all the while working because she was blacklisted by McCarthy and wasn't able to publish for 20 or 30 years. So she has this crazy history as, a waitress and a factory worker, and had to be a true member of the working class just to survive. But along the way, created this amazing literature of the working class. And so I'm trying to draw on the experience that she had to create a different character, and putting yourself in the place of someone who has been so shut down by society, and the society that we think of as so free and has total freedom of expression. To hear people tell it, it's not the experience that Meridel Lasser had, and that's really troubling to get inside of and alter my understanding of how this country actually deals with dissenters.
So the dark, and as soon as I'm done, we'll open up for questions. So the dark that I take you to is into the rage, and the whole time I was writing this book, there was so much political rage going on, and so I felt like I had to make rage a part of the story. I didn't want it to be political, but I wanted it to feel as uncomfortable as the rage feels now, which is entrenched and reflexive and just like this immediate hate and distrust for, when someone feels like they're on that opposite side. And so throughout the story, I'm digging down into the rage to try to find the grief and the loss, and maybe like little bridges of where we can kind of reach each other. And I felt like as I was digging into the rage, I felt like there was, at the root of it was, who am I now? Like a lot of the people that carried the rage in this book are this handful of unemployed and underemployed men, and I feel like they were saying, if all of my identity and my strength and my pride is wrapped up in this thing that's slipping away, then who am I? And are you someone who's trying to take that thing away from me? And then at the same time, as I wanted people to feel some empathy for what it feels like, the toll of being unemployed and underemployed for a long time, and the loss of identity. I wanted to also show what it feels like to be that different person in a town that has a strong identity, and that identity doesn't speak to them, and that person feels alone with their passions and their opinions and their voice. And so this is the dialogue I'm trying to have within the book, and people have different reactions to going into the dark and stuff, so, but we keep trying to open up those dialogues. So does anyone have questions?
I'm wondering if you've written any other novels.
This is my first novel. I was a nonfiction author before I came out of the dark.
Or came toward it, I guess.
Well, and that's actually that might be true. It didn't disturb me at all to go into it. And in fact, I'm kind of a practical, cautious kind of person. And in the beginning of this, where I was wrestling with where is this going to go, and in fact it eventually took a very different track than what I envisioned, the word reckless came into my mind, and I believe that one of our friends put it there. And it was like the first time in my life I ever thought, I'm going to go to the end of this road, regardless of what it costs me.
Yeah.
And it cost in a lot of ways. It did. And it didn't scare me, and I didn't have any regrets, so I guess it was my turn, I think you said, to go into the dark and bring it forward.
Ellen, what was your family's reaction? Were there people in your family that felt disrupted by this, or were they excited that you were exploring this, or?
So, and thank you for asking that question, and I do have to say that is the question that comes up at every single reading. At the time I decided to do this, there were only 2 people alive who could have helped me. And one of them said 3 words, "Don't know anything." And the other one said, "I know you're interested, but this has caused so much strife in our family, it has even made me physically ill, and I'm just done." And there were other peripheral people along the way that I approached, and none of them wanted to talk about it. So I told the story the way it came to me, and if they take issue with it, it's not like I wasn't listening. But it's interesting to me that that question gets asked a lot, because it just kind of, the reality behind it is that there are still people who won't talk about it. So,
What were your sources then?
what were my sources? A lot of public documents, a lot of going to all the places, all the locations, and talking to people who were there, and being in the actual structures and reading the vibe in these places. And I probably read 2 miles of microfilm newspapers. And newspapers 100 years ago reported every little thing. And it was a good way to just kind of reconstruct the personalities of the towns and the townspeople, and then to add the public documents in. And of course, I was a nonfiction writer, and I had originally envisioned this as a creative nonfiction narrative, but there were enough holes in the facts that I wouldn't have been able to do that. And also it just seemed that I was being pulled to extrapolate a larger story. So the framework of it is accurate, but I think anyone who writes historical fiction you can pull deeply from personal experience and from research, but there comes a point where you have to take it as your story and believe that somebody wants this story told, and just go for it.
Yes.
This is a question about your practices. What does critique look like for each of you in your practice before reviews, or before publication?
I have I'm very private. I'm kind of like the Gabriel Garcia Marquez model of don't show anyone until you feel like you know where you are. So I go through several drafts by myself. My go-to editor is a guy named David Yulin. He's the only person I let touch my work. He was the editor of the LA Times Book Review for 30 years, and
How'd you land him?
he's just a friend. But the best people for me are they totally know and understand your work and your heart, but they help you find your story and they help you tighten it. So.
Well, I'm doing really different things with the book I'm working on now than I have in the past. I haven't had much of a writer's community. Billings is not a huge literary center. There are some people, but not really working in the same vein, most of us. My husband has done a certain amount of reading for me, bless him. But he's a software engineer, so yeah, you take what you can get. And then for this one, the one with the character based on Maridel Lasser, there's another major character in this book who is a Venezuelan expat journalist, much younger than the Maridel character. And so I'm digging into some history that my family has with Venezuela and what's been going on there recently. And I've been interviewing Venezuelan expats, because practically nobody still lives there, and if they do, they don't have very good connectivity. But I've been seeking out people, in a lot of cases total strangers, and I kind of find them by word of mouth and asking them for input on things I'm writing about, because it needs to be, the voice of that people is so important and so strangled right now that I need to hear directly from them. But then my agent does a lot of good reading for me, a lot of really close just textual response, and sends me detailed letters about larger themes she thinks I need to work through. And then it gets to the point where my editor weighs in, and it's similar. A couple different phases. She'll start with the overall editorial letter, and then we get into page by page, word by word, and I'm tremendously grateful for that. It feels like a person with my best interests at heart who actually knows what she's doing. It's never felt coercive, or you must do this. And then they've got copy editors who are geniuses, and to have that level of attention to your work is an incredible privilege.
Was it you? I can't even see you. My critique process is different for my nonfiction books than for my novel. In my nonfiction books, I have a 15-year relationship with an editor who might as well be me. She understands me that well, and she's never wrong, so I don't mess with that. For this book, because it was a much longer writing process, I had 2 writer friends who were with me the whole way, and I can't even tell you how many revisions they read, 100. Truly remarkable. But what it came right down to in the end was I had an editor who was identified by my publisher, and she understood this book so well that she was actually willing to go to bat on some things for me in disagreement with my editor. And as Carrie was saying, it's just so wondrous to have a person that you can trust like that, who knows the heart of what you're trying to say and will bring you all the possibilities. And I've been lucky in my writing career to have editors who always said, these are suggestions, the work is yours. And of course, they're suggestions based on what they know about what readers want, what an audience wants, or how the book is going to be placed in the marketplace and these kind of things. But it always comes down to, there will be, and for the most part, I value their expertise and take advantage of probably 98% of it, but there's always going to be those few little things that your heart will not let you change. And you do it knowing that there may be consequences for that. But it is a process, and I absolutely believe that a writer is only as good as their willingness to work with a good editor, and I mean a good one, not just anyone. It sounds like we've all been really fortunate that way.
Thank you so much for coming out. And there's books in the back, and we'll sign them.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.